Daily Planet Theater. Glad you could be here. This is the Lunchtime Discovery Series. Every Wednesday at noon, we take the opportunity to meet interesting people who are doing interesting work out there in the worlds of science, nature, conservation, art education, and more. The Lunchtime Discovery Series is organized by the folks at the Office of Environmental Education over in the Department of Environmental Quality. They reach out, find these cool people to bring here into the museum where we've got the space and the ability to broadcast this program out and have everyone come and gather with us in order to hear these great stories. Of course, February is Black History Month, so they have put together just a really impressive program, all celebrating legacies of people and places. And for today's program, we are not traveling very far, I think, from the Museum of Natural Sciences for our program. Today we're going to be hearing from Kyleene Rooks. Kyleene is the park manager at Walnut Creek Wetland Park. Today, I think outside the museum, when I looked, it looked like a good day to be a wetland. It is very gray and rainy out there. Maybe not a great day to be in a wetland. And so, I don't know, maybe Kyleene is like, yay, inside presentations today. Maybe, just maybe. But everyone, let's welcome Kyleene to the stage. Put your hands together, and let's get ready for today's program.
Sweet. Thank you so much for the introduction. If you catch me looking into my PowerPoint, there are my emotional support notes. But who am I? Like Chris said, my name is Kyleene Rooks. I'm currently serving as the park manager at Walnut Creek Wetland Park, and have been in that role since about November 2022. Too many buttons. This is what happens when you have emotional support notes. But previously, before that, my background is in general biology, and a lot of my work experience has been in agriculture and food systems and providing environmental education surrounding those topics. But what I've always done and always had a passion for is being a part of the public sector, specifically because I feel like local government and public entities really have a role and responsibility in lifting the voice of already existing advocates, and which is particularly important in the story that we're going to talk about today, because oftentimes marginalized communities are advocating for the things that they need and that they want, but their voices aren't necessarily being uplifted or heard. And so we find that to be a really important piece of the work that we do at Walnut Creek Wetland Park that doesn't always get highlighted like our programming or our trash cleanups do. So I'm super excited to tell you about the history today and, you know, just a really positive and success story of Black advocacy. There will be some moments of the presentation where you'll kind of feel us going downwards and you're like, man, Kyleene, I thought you said this was a success story, and I promise that comes at the end. So where is Walnut Creek? Walnut Creek watershed we've got here up on our map. It's the big blue squiggly line, the light blue one. The darker blue ones, if you can manage to see them, are the tributaries that lead into Walnut Creek. Walnut Creek is rather large. It's roughly 24 square miles and starts behind Town Mall in Cary, makes its way all the way to this little red square that we've got. And that little red square is Walnut Creek Wetland Park, and then about 7 miles later makes its way and connects with the Noose. So that little red square is us, Walnut Creek Wetland Park. We're roughly 60 acres, and the park includes Walnut Creek, but also the majority of Little Rock Creek. So Little Rock Creek is an important tributary because it is roughly 1 square mile, but takes in about 95% of the Raleigh downtown stormwater. And that drainage area is all impervious surface, which we'll kind of see how that plays into the flooding at Walnut Creek later into the presentation. But Walnut Creek is roughly 60 acres and is bordered by a couple of landmarks. So we've got Fuller Elementary and Carnage Middle School that we do a lot of collaborating with. We've got St. Ambrose Episcopal Church on the south end of the park that's been there since the 60s and played a really integral role in the advocacy and creation of this park. It's a historically Black church. And then, of course, the historically Black neighborhoods of Rochester Heights and Biltmore Hills as we know them today. So I just want to do a quick Wetland 101. We've got a photo of one of the more undisturbed areas of Walnut Creek up here, but it's really important to understand the many ecological benefits that wetlands have. Wetlands provide crucial habitat. In 2021, the EPA released that more than 1/3 of the United States threatened and endangered species live only in wetlands, and at least half of them use them at some point in their lifetime. So we've got these incredibly biodiverse areas with vulnerable populations that haven't always been well protected. Additionally, wetlands are doing a really good job at pollution and sediment filtration. They improve water quality. So wetlands serve as a place for that water to come in and kind of rest as it slowly makes its way through the vegetation and roots, vegetation that's specifically adapted to wetlands and does a really, really excellent job at pulling those pollutants out through the root system, things like heavy metals and other things that we wouldn't essentially want in our water quality. In addition to those, that unique vegetation, we've also got hydric soils. So hydric soils is just a science word to say soils that are submerged in water long enough throughout the year to create the anaerobic process. And then those soils help filter the water through slowly and make their way, releasing filtered essentially water back through the groundwater and surface water systems. So think of how a sponge works and how it holds water, and if you just leave it on the counter full of water, it'll slowly release it over time. And so a functioning wetland also works pretty similarly. We've also got flood control, and flood control will be a really important component when we're talking about why people needed to advocate for this space to be taken care of. When a wetland is functioning properly, wetlands act like natural green stormwater infrastructure, which is a buzzword right now, particularly in the city of Raleigh as we're developing independent crews to manage green stormwater infrastructure. But essentially, you may or may not be familiar with things like rain gardens. Those are non-regulatory devices, and we have some actually at the park. But wetlands act like this natural stormwater infrastructure by sitting at lower points of elevation. They're designed essentially to funnel all of the stormwater in through them so that they can go through the filtration process. So the land around Walnut Creek Wetland Park following the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction was subdivided from plantations into rented lots and farms owned by formerly enslaved families. A little bit about the history of the property. It starts in the 1800s, late 1800s, so that's that post-Civil War era. And as we're moving into just kind of keeping people's timeline on the same page, because these events feel like they're very far behind, but we're essentially talking about the time of Jim Crow here in the South. So these are the Brimley brothers. They're two naturalists that founded the Museum of Natural Sciences. They immigrated to Raleigh in their late teens based on a chance meeting with the U.S. Department of Agricultural representative in England that convinced them that North Carolina was the hot spot and place to be for all the things that they wanted to do. As naturalists of their time, that included specimen collecting and taxidermying those collections and then selling them to museums all over the world. And they had great success with this. They lived within walking distance from Walnut Creek wetlands, and in many of their writings described the area as pristine, untouched, and incredibly biodiverse. They often rode their bikes through the neighborhood and wanted to scope out the best places for birds and other critters, snakes and amphibians, and who better to ask than the neighborhood kids that lived in the area, because nobody knows where bugs and slugs are better than kids. Unfortunately, the story of the wetland's pristine nature does go downhill from here, but don't worry, remember, this is a success story. So here I've got a photo of a constructed wetland, which is not Walnut Creek Wetland Park, but we previously mentioned that wetlands are excellent at providing pollution control and filtration. And Raleigh is no different in the sense that other municipalities have used constructed wetlands to treat raw sewage. That mimics the same biological processes that are happening in natural landscapes, and it works really, really well. However, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, we weren't constructing wetlands, we already had wetlands that existed, and that includes Walnut Creek. So wetlands were and are still carrying the stigma that they're undesirable land because they house all the things that go bump in the night, all the things that we're a little scared of, mosquitoes, snakes, and bugs. They are also considered undesirable land because you can't really build on them without backfilling them. And backfilling them costs a lot of money and oftentimes don't outweigh the economic gain of whatever it is that you want to put there. So in traditional fashion of using wetlands for raw sewage treatment, Raleigh, the city on the hill, what better place to dump the raw sewage that they needed to process than at the bottom of that hill and in the wetland that will do all the work for you. So it's pretty starking to kind of look at the screen and see sewage discharge and water source in the same slide or in the same sentence, but that's what we had. So Walnut Creek Wetlands became the city's sewage outfall. The city of Raleigh discharged its sewage directly into Walnut Creek and into the wetlands. Unfortunately, the creek was also serving as drinking water for a lot of residents, including those residents in the neighborhoods we now call Rochester Heights and Biltmore Hills, which were filled with primarily for previously enslaved families. And so we had residents drinking water that came from the same creeks and tributaries that raw sewage was being discharged in. So the Clean Water Act passed in 1971, and this dumping of raw sewage continued pretty rigorously through the mid-50s, but with it being made illegal with the Clean Water Act in the 70s, we saw the trickle-down effect that happens when federal government passes law, and it eventually makes its way down to the municipalities. And I'm sure that we're all familiar, at least a little bit, with government speed. So it took a little while. That being said, we know that, that being said, we also know that the NCDEQ, or Department of Environmental Quality, found that the Terry Sanford Federal Building downtown was discharging raw sewage into Walnut Creek as recently as 2020. Somebody had made them aware of a cross-contamination issue between their pipes in the early 2000s, and unfortunately nothing was done about the problem. So we still have ongoing environmental pressures in this area, or in Walnut Creek Wetland in particular. It's just a place that's been unfortunately neglected. So you have a swamp that is essentially full of garbage, and you can no longer use to treat raw sewage. And you can't build on it. So what is it that you do? Unfortunately, instead of using this transition opportunity as a time to pour love into the wetland and the place that we really treasure, the greater Raleigh area, and that includes, unfortunately, our municipality, began dumping garbage here. What are they doing in my swamp? Okay, I just want to take care of all the things that live there. But unfortunately, we have got a quote from Walter Magazine that I think at the office we really appreciate, just in terms of like a very stark description of how people saw the property. But by the 90s, the wetlands were a neglected swath of undeveloped land, an eyesore where passerbys witnessed everything from baby cribs to rusted washing machines to industrial janitorial brushes lurking in the muck, where residents and businesses alike treated the wetland like a landfill. And this is what the area is still kind of known for. There's definitely still a culture of dumping. We still have to make calls to get mattresses and furniture picked up. Previously, the garbage was household waste items, but also a lot of construction materials. So some of our older garbage has become a part of the landscape because it's concrete. And in fact, when they were locating the spot for our building and they were looking for places to make the piles so that the building could be raised off the ground, they actually had to relocate the location of the building 3 times. And that's because as they were doing their digging, they kept running into these just layers of sheet metal and concrete, like I said, that have just become a part of the landscape at this point. Okay, so where does the human element overlap with decades of recorded of environmental abuse? Well, we already know that formerly enslaved families were living in the area and were a part of the communities that received drinking water from Walnut Creek. But it's important to know how housing became what we're currently accustomed to. So post-World War II, city centers all over the country were cleared to make way for highways and infrastructure. Under Jim Crow, this was considered the urban renewal movement, and it made way for highways in rural areas they had previously deemed slums. But we know that that's just a code word, right? So they weren't slums. They were typically really thriving African-American communities. We hear a lot about that throughout North Carolina, historically in Durham and Wilmington, but even Black Wall Street out in Tulsa. And so these were essentially middle-class African-American communities that were decimated or divided for these highway infrastructure projects. Black families were excluded from housing development in North and Northwest Raleigh through covenances. So we didn't do traditional redlining in the way that, kind of halfway across the map, this is where, Black people live and this is where white people live, but it was written into the covenances, and so written into the deeds of housing who could and couldn't own those homes. So Black families were forced to stay in Southeast Raleigh, but they were given permissions to develop housing. And so in Southeast Raleigh, even though they were aware of the flooding issues and the issues that were going on with the wetland, it was their only option was to build essentially these neighborhoods adjacent to what we now refer to as the park. So this is a photo of Rochester Heights and post-construction in 1959. I both love and have a bone to pick with this photo because it's in black and white, and it makes it feel like it's a really long time ago, like people from 1959 aren't still alive right now, which they very much are. They still very much live in their neighborhood. So this neighborhood looks very similar to what we know now because it's a historically registered neighborhood, so lots of infrastructure changes aren't possible on the homes. Many of the residents are still the original legacy residents or their children and grandchildren who have inherited the properties and moved back home, but we're very much aware of the advocacy that their parents and their community put into protecting these homes. So there is a lot of pride within the community, and that pride still exists today. And it's such a wonderful thing to get to work with folks who are so prideful of the place that they live, and they want it to be taken care of, and they want it to be well maintained. And so we have partners all over the place. We never have to do it alone. It's wonderful. When we talk about Rochester Heights, we're talking about how it looks now. But previously, it also included current day Biltmore Hills neighborhood. And I'm gonna get ready to show you some maps and so that we can kind of understand how the two communities became separate instead of just the one Rochester Heights. So here you've got a circle around Rochester Heights, and right above it you can see you've got Walnut Creek Wetland Park. I also wanna point out some of the tributaries that are leading into Walnut Creek Wetland Park. You've got one essentially that runs on the back end of Rochester Heights behind the neighborhood between I-40 and the Wetland Park. And then you've got the neighborhood of Biltmore Hills, which is on the other side of I-40, but previously it was all one singular neighborhood. So running between the neighborhoods, you can see is the I-40 Beltline. Thanks to this idea of urban renewal, this beltline split the neighborhood to more easily traffic wealthy white residents from the northern end of Raleigh into their work in downtown. Given its name, the elevation of Biltmore Hills neighborhood is on a hill, and therefore at a higher elevation than Rochester Heights, whereas Rochester Heights is saddled right between Walnut Creek and that tributary we mentioned that runs behind the neighborhood. So the increased impervious surface, or hardscape, from I-40 was exacerbated what was already existing regularly nuisance flooding issues. We say nuisance flooding, but no flooding is convenient when we're talking about the destruction of the foundation of our homes. So all of that flooding really came to a head in 1996 with Hurricane Fran. When Hurricane Fran happened, we saw flooding all across the city, particularly in the current day Rochester Heights. You had the flooding of the tributary that led into Walnut Creek and the flooding of the wetland park. Wetland parks are wetlands in general are natural green stormwater infrastructure because they have the right soils, substrate, and vegetation to deal with flooding. But when you don't have a functioning wetland, it can't do its job. So imagine that you've plugged your sponge with all types of pins and needles, and now it's not absorbing the water at all. So you saw a lot of flooding from both ends, essentially funneling into the neighborhood of Rochester Heights. And so we had a situation essentially where 90% of the homes in Rochester Heights were flooded. A tributary of Walnut Creek that runs behind and sometimes through Onelia Foxwell's house. She says the disaster caused people to be rescued by people in canoes. So you had neighbors canoeing other neighbors out. You had folks who were stuck in their homes and trapped. You really just had this awful situation. And when we're talking about hurricane flooding, and flooding in particular at this level, we're not just talking about the destruction of our homes, which is just as devastating. We're also talking about the increase in ability to transmit waterborne diseases. We're talking about infrastructure damage, long-term damages to the way people live. The city had a response to this. So the response of city council at the time, essentially, and I'll just kind of leave the article for you to read if you're more of a word-for-word person, but the decision of city council at the time was to essentially hold the residents responsible for infrastructure damage over the course of 10 years through their taxes. Similar infrastructure damage was done on the northern end of Raleigh, but the same tax was not implemented. The city was going to use FEMA recovery funds for a lot of that infrastructure damage. Some of the FEMA recovery funds were directed towards the neighborhood of Rochester Heights. I say some because it is a very small chunk, and the result of it really was the demolition of 4 homes. The flooding had essentially swept those homes off of their foundations, and so they used that FEMA relief money to destroy the homes, and the city now owns all 4 of these FEMA lots that will never be developed on again. That includes any type of housing or like long-term city infrastructure. They're just not permitted for that. So this is kind of where we have the beginning of our story for advocacy. The parishioners of St. Ambrose Episcopal Church was a church that was relocated in the 60s to the back end of our property. And the church began, and the petitioners met and began to discuss environmental justice issues facing Walnut Creek watershed. And it was really as a direct result, some of that advocacy started as a direct result of the city council decision to tax the citizens of Rochester Heights for the infrastructure. So they began with 2 things. One, they went around and used petitions and signed petitions essentially advocating for their rights, advocating for a city to be able to equally distribute funds, and essentially create a situation of equity rather than injustice. So up here, I feel like it's really important for us to share the definition of environmental justice. I feel like there's not always a common understanding, but what's most important to me out of this very lengthy definition is meaningful involvement, particularly of all people, regardless of anything, right? We've got all the boxes to check, but it's meaningful involvement regardless of race and all other affiliation, to make sure that people are able and have the tools and resources to advocate for human health and the environment, so that people are fully protected from disproportionate adverse human health risks and environmental risks. So the petitioners were able to meet, and the second thing that they did was they started organizing cleanups. And so Norman and Betty Camp start to come into our story here. Betty Camp was a woman leader in the church, and so she coordinated lots of volunteers. She baked hundreds of biscuits and brought everyone out to dredge out baby cribs and tires and all sorts of yucky eyesore worth of garbage. These cleanups still continue to this day. We host them twice a year, the first Saturday of April, so that's coming up and is a posted volunteer opportunity. Had to self-plug. And then we also have the first Saturday, so long as it doesn't fall in line with the weekend of the holiday, first Saturday in September as well for a cleanup. And I'll talk a little bit more about the success of what we've had with those cleanups towards the end. So the petitioners, after they met, were able to really identify 3 issues. They identified frequent and demoralizing flooding of their homes. They had been withstanding the nuisance flooding for decades, but after Hurricane Fran, they said enough is enough. And so I have been in St. Ambrose Church, and you can still see the damages that were caused by a lot of that flooding, particularly in their kitchen area. They've got some really cool, super bad women over there who are just kind of kicking butt and taking names and working to get some grant funding to remodel the kitchen so that it can continue to be a space of collection, but also so that it can be a place of education and providing health and nutrition programming to the children of the church. They've also been able to identify the longstanding dumping problem, which they started to remedy themselves with big sweep cleanup opportunities, but really wanted to advocate for no more dumping, right? We can clean up the garbage that's there, but if we keep adding garbage, then we're not making any progress. And then overall improving the wetlands ecology. And I think this part is particularly cool. I love it when communities get together whose backgrounds may or may not actually be collectively in the sciences, or particularly with wetland ecology, which I feel like is its own little niche science piece. But they started researching and learning, what is it supposed to look like when it's functioning? What is it supposed to do when it rains and we have a hurricane? And how does this impact the place that we live and the way that we raise our families here? So St. Ambrose joined up with 2 other local Episcopal churches whose names I won't be able to remember, but I know one of them is in Cary, and I believe the other one is in downtown Raleigh. And they formed the Episcopalians for Environmental Justice. It's quite a bit of a mouthful, but as secular groups got more involved, they developed into Partners for Environmental Justice to carry on the same mission. We still work with Partners of Environmental Justice today. We participate in their monthly board meetings, and we partner on several projects. They have their hands a little bit in everything all over the south end of Raleigh, but particularly as it means to Walnut Creek Wetland Park, they'll always have a place in our space because we wouldn't be here without them. So community members continued to gather and educate themselves about wetland ecology, and then they began reaching out for support and advocacy. And that is where we get Dr. Norman Camp and his wife, Betty Camp. So Dr. Camp grew up in the area as a child. I'm going to do another little plug. The previous manager of Walnut Creek Wetland Park, Stacy Hagwood, worked with the Camp family and knew him personally because Dr. Camp unfortunately passed away in 2018. I never had the chance to meet the man, but his legacy is so strong. I feel like I knew him. She wrote a children's book that we then purchased, kind of like a live rendition or a child-sized model flip book that you can interact with in our park if you ever want to hear the story about his childhood and what inspired him. But essentially, Dr. Camp grew up in the area and playing in Little Rock Creek and remembered the raw sewage issues, but he was inspired by the wetland as kind of a living lab. And so he went off to get higher education at Shaw University, where he obtained his PhD and where he met his wife, Betty Camp. He was a science educator. He had his hands in all sorts of committees. He was just a true champion and advocate, and he was a really, really gifted communicator. If Norman Camp knew what he wanted, he was going to get it. And he wouldn't have been able to do it without his wife Betty's support, who, like I said, coordinated all these big, beautiful cleanups to help dredge trash out of the wetland. And today, our nature center is actually named after them. It's the Norman and Betty Camp Education Center. So Walnut Creek has been called a lot of things. So we come to Walnut Creek 2000. Now that Dr. Camp is on the case, he worked with Dr. Moore at NC State and his agricultural students to create a master plan. The goal was to present the city with a plan that they had created from start to finish. So in creating that plan, he worked with the Natural Learning Institute and offered public sessions for engagement with the community and other stakeholders like the St. Ambrose Episcopal Church and local schools, and began taking in the ideas of what people wanted this space to look like and how they wanted it to serve them. And they essentially came to the conclusion of what is our mission and our vision today, which is to manage flooding or manage the property for flooding and stormwater so that we can protect the people that live near this green space, and then providing education, particularly to youth, about wetland ecology, about the health of wetlands and the history of this park, but also just getting kids excited about being outside and in nature. So, my emotional support notes are failing me. So we had this public engagement process. We had these biannual cleanups. And in the process of all of this, Dr. Camp and the Partners for Environmental Justice are advocating for this Walnut Creek 2000 master plan proposal. So you've got 10 years of advocacy from about 97, 98 after that Hurricane Fran incident to about 2003 when they advocated and lobbied that the city set aside parks bond money to adequately develop the site as a space for learning and provide staff to manage the land. The park officially became established in 2009 and the building was erected in 2011. Woo! We've got our success, but that being said, how do we uphold that legacy, right? Because we've now gone from a land that was managed by the people to a land that's managed by the municipality. And so it's a really big deal that the municipality, recognized their wrongdoings and mistreatment of the property and used park bond money to make it a part of the park system for management. But what does that really look like in the long term, right? We can put our money where our mouth is, but we also got to do the walking and the talking. So we can't do what we do without partnerships, right? So we work with partners of environmental justice, particularly on projects that require community engagement, so that we can go above and beyond the expectation of how we engage citizens in our processes, because we want them to be a part of the planning, right? If we want to uplift the voices of advocates, then it's important that they're a part of the planning process and not the review process. You want somebody to be a part of the planning process because who knows better about what they need and what they want than the people that live there? So they've been a champion in helping us partner for that. We also have worked with Sound Rivers, which is a riverkeeper organization here in North Carolina, Water Resource Research Institute, and NC State, particularly when it comes to doing water quality analysis and assessment. So that we know what's coming into our creeks through stormwater and how can we remove those things, or how can we prevent them from entering the body of water to begin with. We have all sorts of collaborations with internal City of Raleigh departments, and then of course what we couldn't do is manage the land as well and as effectively as we do without community volunteers and leaders who want to participate and want to get those boots on the ground. So, in effort to manage, a lot of what we do is invasive species removal. So our park is roughly 60 acres and was primarily an ash tree canopy forest. If you're familiar with trees, then you know that the pest, the emerald ash borer, came through and really decimated that population of trees. We only have 300 ash trees standing today, but they comprise 90% of our upper canopy, which means we have a forest that doesn't look the way it's supposed to. It gets a lot of sunlight to the ground, which leaves a lot of room for invasives. Because we're a bottomland wetland, we're not just collecting garbage from our upstream neighbors, we're also gathering seeds from getting seeds in the seed bank from invasives. So these are quite a few of the invasives that we try to manage currently. We've done some large-scale invasive removals, high-density forest repair to the riparian buffer. So recently we just planted over 1,100 trees and 7,000 square feet, which puts them at about 2 feet apart instead of traditional planting, which is about 5 to 8 feet apart depending on the variety of tree. And we planted all 4 canopy layers at the same time, upper, mid, lower, and brush level. And so this is with the idea that they'll grow faster in a shorter amount of time, and in 2 years they'll have created a microclimate, and the die-off rate is much lower than if you were to do with traditional planting, which requires a lot of watering and a lot of maintenance. And so this is just one of the ways that we are working to restore the creek bank so that we can prevent future flooding events from leaving the park. And here are our lovely NC State volunteers who demolished about 1,000 of that square feet. We also talked a lot about trash, right? So we've got all this increased impervious surface coming from downtown through Little Rock Creek and into Walnut Creek. We've got this culture of dumping, and we've got historical dumping. So we've got old trash, new trash, shiny trash, cool trash. I used that one yesterday. I wrote it at 8 p.m. Um, so we've got some means to take care of the garbage that exists within the park. We do that through those annual cleanups. We have school groups that put in service work to do cleanups. And then in that bottom left corner, we've also got NORA, who stands for No Further Refuse, named by our NEC Neighborhood Ecology Core Teen program. We work with Sound Rivers to manage this trash trap. And essentially it sits in Little Rock Creek with the job of collecting as much of the garbage that comes through stormwater as possible. I'd say she does a pretty solid job given the take that she's got a big responsibility. And then we've got some comparative photos of the amount of tires that we're still pulling out years later. So the News and Observer from 1998. These were the cleanups that Betty Camp was a part of. And then we've got a student intern right here in 2023 next to our more recent pile of tires, where I think we collected 27 tires, including a semi-truck tire. So for questions about tires in particular, in the 90s, they were used for a lot of stream bank restoration. We now know all of the things that tires leach into the water, and so that's not a practice that's used anymore. But that being said, as they fall back into the bank or as old tires unearth themselves from the wetland, we try to make an active effort essentially to pull those out. And programming, it was so important to Dr. Norman and Betty Camp that programming and education be the other forefront of what we do. So not just managing the land, but teaching others how to manage the land. It was Dr. Camp's dream that other Black children in the neighborhood wouldn't have to hop on a bus or a bike. They would be able to walk to the nearest green space. And so a lot of what we do is elementary and pre-K programming, but we also host a lot of family events and also collaborate with partners to work with teens. So here in these photos, you've got pictures of one of our favorite events, which is our annual Mud Day event that happens on the third Saturday in August every year. And so we see roughly 600 people. I would say about a quarter of them come from the neighborhood. And we've got a giant mud pit and a mudslide and everything that we hope that Dr. Camp would be inspired by in order to uphold that legacy. Additionally, we teach folks about all the little critters that live in the wetland, including some snapping turtles, some salamanders. This little rabbit guy was found when we were doing a work day, and we were able to relocate him somewhere where he would be safe. And we also teach native and invasive ID classes. So we can't do this work alone. Part of where invasives come from is that they look really pretty and beautiful in gardens and people's yards. And those seeds get carried away and dispersed by animals, birds, wind, rain, all of the things. And so being able to teach people what's supposed to be here and what's not supposed to be here is really helpful in kind of just promoting that the community plant things that are native and are supposed to be here and aren't going to dump more invasive seeds into the areas that we're managing. And then everybody who's ever taken a program or I feel like has seen a presentation also wants to see the really cool animals that we have that live there. So I have a few short clips. So we do have some wildlife and some mammals. We've got beavers, we've got otters, we've had a bobcat, although I don't know that she lives in the park right now. And we have a small deer population as well. I think it's particularly unique and proof that a lot of the work that Dr. Camp started, but that we're continuing to uphold, is working. The things that are supposed to live here are living here, and they'll only continue to thrive as we can continue to manage the land. So I think I've got 2 more to share, just because who doesn't love the animals? All right. And so this is just an accumulation of all of that, of the programming and the land management that we do. But really, what we try to integrate into each of our programs, whether we're teaching adults or we're teaching children, is just at least some part of the history, particularly because we want people to be able to walk away from our courses not just feeling like they know more about the ecology of wetlands, but like they feel like that they can go and take skills that they learned and become champions for their own spaces and become really great advocates for the things that they want as well to see in their neighborhood. And so that can be anything from cleanups and restoration to, other political issues. We just want to be able to set people up with the most amount of skills that we can before they leave us, and if we feel like our really rich history does that. And so I want to kind of end this on a little blurb from Dr. Norman Camp. The Walnut Creek wetland is a special one because it's in the heart of a Black community that has had neglect in the past because of what it was and what it is today. I understood the wildlife, and I saw and treasured and knew that if we developed a wetland park here, that other people could experience that kind of joy and enlightenment when they experience the wild creatures in an urban setting. And I really want to, I think that's a beautiful quote to end on the idea that, success in advocacy is not just one moment. It's a series of moments that build upon each other and inspire the people around you to participate. And in the case of Dr. Norman Camp, continue after your passing and create a legacy for learning and love of nature. So I've got some really good references that can always be linked in the YouTube channel. Just more about some of our partners and partners of environmental justice, and some videos of Dr. Camp and what he has to share with people. And that's me.
Let's give Kyleene a round of applause. Thank you very much. Incredible story. Thank you for coming and sharing it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And it's a story that I'm always happy to share.
If you're here in the room with me and you've got questions you want to ask, just wave at me. I'll bring you a microphone. If you're up on the balconies, you can step up, wave down at us. We'll call on you. You can yell at us. And if you are watching online on YouTube, I know lots of people are, go ahead and get your thoughts, questions, and experiences typed into the chat. That way, we've got that pulled up, and we can get your questions into the program as well. And the first thing that I saw in the chat, Kyleene, was they wanted to see the video of the beaver again. And the river otters.
I told you, if I don't include them, people are going to want to know where the beaver's at.
We've got a wildlife crowd in the audience for this show, and this is the stuff they really like to see. Look at that. Beautiful.
We actually have a family of beavers. They're very social creatures. We have roughly anywhere between 4 to 6 lodges, depending on the season, at any time in the park, because they'll stay by generationally. Something particularly unique about our beavers is that they live in the floodway and not in the actual creek. So in most places, they live in the actual creek, and in our case, they are the ones who are engineering and developing a lot of our wetlands and turning them from seasonal into year-round, which is beautiful, and it means that we have an opportunity to observe them in every season.
Oh, that is really cool. All right, now I know I want to go see these. I'm going to come down and check them out. Bring my binoculars, I guess.
Yeah, so we actually have a gear closet. So anybody who wants to come and visit Walnut Creek Wetland Park but doesn't feel like that they have the equipment that's necessary, we provide a variety of sizes in boots and waders and dip nets, as well as some field guides, ID sheets. And then for the littles, we've got stuff for scavenger hunts, and we've got essentially a class set of binoculars.
That's perfect. I love everything about that. That's incredible. So let's see. A question that I had for you was, you showed us a long list of partners that you work with on a regular basis to maintain Walnut Creek, continue the legacy of the Camp family, and keep doing the good work that they started, and that the environmental justice work that was started by the local community. What's it like today managing those partnerships, keeping everyone together, keeping the work going? Because maintaining the legacy is one thing, but actually looking forward to the next 5, 10, 25 years of what Walnut Creek Wetland Park is going to be like is also very important.
Yeah, absolutely. So maintaining the partnerships is actually one of my favorite parts of the job, because it's the people component. And it sounds a little silly, but it's really all about human interaction, and making sure that you're building those and establishing those relationships authentically. And it sounds silly because pre-COVID, I think maybe it didn't sound so silly, but now a lot of folks want to meet virtually and stuff, and I understand the flexibility in that, but just in terms of the longevity of partnerships, we find it really important to have that face-to-face interaction. Something else that's really important to the management of the park, I think, is meeting people where they already are. And so it's wonderful when we can have engagement events and then people attend them, but we're only getting a small select group of people who would likely attend those events anyways. What's really important to us is showing up in spaces that the community is already gathering. And so that can be at neighborhood or HOA meetings. We've attended church and been able to speak to essentially the congregation about some ongoing projects that we have and how they can engage through all of the processes, planning and implementation, and then what that product looks like and how it's maintained. And so I just really think having the ability to see people where they are and show up authentically has been the most successful way that we've been able to manage partnerships.
That's great stuff. I have to imagine that when you show up to some of these places, people are excited to see you.
Sometimes.
I hope so.
Most of the time. I think people are always excited to see us and excited to hear about what's going on, because I know oftentimes we are limited in the ways that we can communicate with the public. And so that it's really nice, I think, to have a person that they can say, hey, I know who you are. I know how I can get in contact with you, and I know how I can ask questions because you'll come to me. You'll answer them. Sometimes we are also kind of a catch-all. Walnut Creek Wetland Park functions very similarly to a lot of recreation community centers. And so there's a lot of times that we'll get calls about questions that are a little bit outside of our scope of work, but we're always happy to interact with those folks and be able to point them into the right direction so that they can get their questions answered accordingly.
Hi. Can you say a little bit about, maybe you have a story about how the center's impacted teens or other kids living nearby?
Yeah, absolutely. So Walnut Creek Wetland Park is the host, although not necessarily the facilitator, of a after-school teen program called Neighborhood Ecology Corps. It's managed by the Environmental Education Program Support Office, EAPS, who's overseen by Cheryl McGlory. And so we're working primarily with neighborhood kids in ideally a 5 to 8-ish mile radius of the park. And they are coming in yearly cohorts based on like age, grade level, and general knowledge of ecology. And so some of the kids, particularly in the first year cohort, which is about 6th through 8th grade, have had limited to no exposure to ecology and environmental practices and outdoors. And so that's a very introductory level cohort. Year 2 cohort is kind of learning about how to apply all of the things that they learned in year 1. So you've got a series of successional learning. And then that year 3 is really learning how to be community advocates and participants. And so they're taking the things that they cumulatively learned in year 1 and year 2, and they're choosing projects that they're particularly passionate about and trying to figure out how to commit to outreach and engagement.
Thank you.
Hey, I think maybe like 4 years ago, like around 2021, there was a lot of discussion with the city of Raleigh about allowing a development called Downtown South that was kind of causing great alarm in Rochester Heights. Was that going to affect the Wetland Park, and do you know what's happened subsequently? Because I heard a lot about it at one time, and then I kind of didn't.
So it's definitely still an ongoing project, and so what the final product will be, I'm not necessarily as familiar with. I do know that Partners of Environmental Justice advocated for, I want to say, roughly $1.5 million of the $1 billion project to be allocated to green stormwater infrastructure to help manage some of that. But with any increased amount of hardscape or impervious surface, our watersheds are going to feel that effect. And so it may change the way that we have to manage some of our creek banks, Little Rock Creek in particular, but also Walnut Creek. They are both handling volumes of stormwater that they were never designed for. East Coast creeks are supposed to be kind of flat, low-lying, and meandering, whereas if you've ever come and visit our park, or if you've ever seen a creek bank with the steep cuts that kind of look like canyons, it's usually because they're taking on more volume of water than they're equipped for, at a velocity that they're also not equipped for, right? Because they're coming at greater speeds. And we're seeing heavier rain events in a shorter amount of time in relation to climate. So it'll change the way that we manage our bank system, but just in terms of like what we can do while we're developing, we can, practice better practices and better stormwater management practices, and that includes that green stormwater infrastructure. I'm always happy to see more money dedicated to it, but I'm just one guy.
You said 1.5 million out of $1 billion. What is that? 0.15%?
Yes.
Is my math good? Okay. Yeah, always love to see good green stormwater infrastructure, good green infrastructure wherever we can get it. If we can't turn this thing back into a flat creek that covers 500 acres.
Yeah, so our creeks are what we would consider like mathematically beyond restoration in the way that we currently do like an engineering restoration project for stream banks. So what we can do right now is plant a little bit off of the bank in hopes that it's far enough back that those trees can get established root systems and help hold the remainder of the bank in place. We have some green stormwater infrastructure at the park. If it's not something that you're totally familiar with, we actually have couple of examples of designs. So some of that is street work, and so that's on the edge of the curb where it's essentially picking up the water off the street and filtering it through vegetation. And then we've also got rain gardens and bioretention areas that have tall grasses that help manage those things and have root systems that work to filter out pollutants.
All right. Question from the chat for you. Is the cleanup of Walnut Creek trickling down to a cleaner Neuse River?
So, can you repeat the question one more time?
Does the cleanup of Walnut Creek lead to a cleaner Neuse River?
Absolutely. So Walnut Creek makes its way about 7 miles outside of the park into the Neuse River, and so anything that we can do to the tributaries to maintain tributaries and clean them up that go into the Neuse River will lead to a cleaner Neuse River. We're all impacted by our upstream neighbors. And so for us in Walnut Creek, that starts in Cary, but for the Neuse River, that includes all of the tributaries that touch the Neuse River. So participating in any of our cleanups or picking up trash on your sidewalk if you live within the Neuse River watershed, all long-term has a positive impact on the Neuse River.
Excellent stuff. Kyleene, do you feel good about the future?
I do. I feel good about the future, and this is why. I'll tell you why. We have seen some pretty catastrophic flooding in recent events with the recent Hurricane Helene. But what I will say is they were primarily contained to the park. So even though it didn't look so hot in the park, it looked great in the surrounding neighborhoods. We had some nuisance flooding on some of our immediate side streets, but for the most part, we were able to keep it contained within Walnut Creek. And then we saw the recession of those waters that came probably up to my hip. And for those of you who are online, I'm kind of tall. Probably waters up to my hip. We saw them recede within 18 hours. By the time we came back the next morning, you couldn't tell that it had previously flooded the Greenway. Wow. And so while that may pose some short-term problems within the park, long-term, I think that what it means is that we're doing a good job. We're managing the vegetation that's there and that's supposed to be there. We're having little destructive impact and creating no rise by not creating infrastructure that essentially creates flooding in other places. And we're still dredging out the garbage. And so in the last fiscal year, so for us that's January 1 to June 30th, we actually dredged 10,000 pounds worth of garbage in the last year out of Walnut Creek. Whoa. And that is within the essentially the 5 of the 60 acres that are most accessible and not dangerous to the public. We have a few sensitive areas that are kind of deep swamp ecology that are kind of collecting and accumulating older trash but we can work with the smaller groups in the winter who've kind of got the stamina to bring those bags out. We love teen volunteers to help maintain that issue.
That's fantastic. I love to hear it.
Thank you, thank you. We're really excited, and we love our jobs, so, you know, we're having a good time.
Well, and glad to see that that for the story of Walnut Creek, that you're beginning to get these environmental justice issues addressed, like terrible flooding that from Fran in the 90s that was very hard on a community and then made worse by poor decision making after that begin to change. Like
Yeah, absolutely.
establishing the park, getting the wetland benefits, but also it sounds like getting so much of the community involved to maintain these spaces and then making it valuable to decision makers to maintain and invest in those spaces in ways that they should have been all along.
Yeah, absolutely. That's my favorite thing, is to get people to come look at the park, because they'll be like, oh my goodness, what is this? And I'd be like, hey, I can tell you how to fix it. But no, it's great. I love getting people to the park. I love giving people the opportunity to kind of tour the area and hear the history, but particularly because you want to create future investment. And so we've been working really hard with Partners of Environmental Justice to kind of come up with a functional intergenerational model. Right now, we've got legacy residents who are still championing for the space, and we've got some adults who are championing for the space as well, but really getting the youth involved in advocacy early, so that they know that they have rights to stand up for the spaces that they enjoy playing in and that they enjoy living in. And so working with them to kind of create that intergenerational learning is an opportunity for us to move forward and create future advocates, so that the legacy continues beyond my term as manager at Walnut Creek Wetland Park.
Kyleene, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Excellent presentation. And thanks everybody for coming out to today's program. Of course, we'll be back again next Wednesday at noon with another Lunchtime Discovery series. Next week, we'll be hearing from Crystal Regan, who's the director of Tryon Palace. Don't miss out. We're going to hear about 250 years of history at Tryon Palace. You don't want to miss it. Of course, you can join us here in the SECU Daily Planet Theater in downtown Raleigh. Crystal will be right here on stage just like today, but you can also find us on YouTube at the museum's YouTube channel. Hit up the museum social media at Natural Sciences or at North Carolina EE, and you can get all the details there, or go to the website eenorthcarolina.org for links and information, programs, and events. Thanks for participating, everybody. Have a great week. We'll see you next time. Bye.